A question that often comes up is whether you should or how much pruning you should do at the day that you plant a tree. And the answer to that is as little as possible. About the only kind of pruning you want to do when you're planting a tree is to take off any dead branches. And sometimes in the planting process, often you'll lay the tree down, particularly if you're going to bare root it. And occasionally you can break a branch. You'll want to do a reduction cut to deal with that break. But and conceivably, you could deal with codominant leads at that time. Again, you can lay the tree down. You can easily get to those upper branches where you typically see codominance. Um, but you don't want to take too much off because the planting process in and of itself is traumatic for the tree. So you don't want to add to it. And it needs all the leaves that it has in order to acclimate and start to grow. So we typically will plant trees and not come back to them for pruning purposes, at least for a couple of years. We usually come back to any of our plantings every few months, actually, to make sure the mulching is okay, to do weeding and that kind of thing. Make sure if we've used um, deer pens, deer cages to keep deer out, we'll check to make sure that they're intact and still functional. But we don't prune for a couple of years. And then we usually prune out into time every couple of years. You don't have to do it every year. I mentioned before that there are actually three categories of pruning cuts: removal, where you take the whole branch off; reduction, where you take part of the branch off; and then heading cuts. And we often use heading cuts with orchard trees, and we're not going to talk about that. So we'll just be talking about removal and reduction. And removal is just what it says. You're taking the entire branch off back to whatever its source is, back to the trunk or back to a branch that it comes off of. And with reduction, we're just taking part of the branch off. And we typically do that if you know you have a branch coming out of the tree and something happens at the tip of it and it breaks. And when you have a natural break like that on a branch, they're very rarely clean breaks. They're usually splintered. So you get a big surface area where decay can get in, and it's healthier for the tree and easier for it to recover from a pruning cut than it is from a splintered natural cut. The trick with reduction cuts is you can't just make them anywhere on the branch. So you got your breakout at the end here. You're going to come back in the branch towards what it's growing from to the point where you find another branch coming off it that's at least 1/3 as large as the branch that you're going to make the pruning cut on. If you can't find a branch that's 1/3 the size, at least, which is going to become the new lead, um, you may have to take the branch off because it has to have a fairly substantial branch to take over the lead position, or it will most likely, the branch will die. And we'll give you examples of this as we go along. And here we have a removal cut. We're taking the entire branch off. So a smaller branch is being cut back to a larger branch. That's removal. Reduction, larger branch is being cut back to a smaller branch. So here's somebody made a decision on this. They said, hey, I found a branch here that's at least 1/3 the size of the branch I need to make the cut on. So that's a safe place to make the cut. So they cut back to it. Later on, we'll talk about, how they decided to make the cut right there. It's kind of technical. We'll get into that stuff. So generally what you want to see, unless you've got a multi-trunk tree or a spreading tree, is a single leader. You're looking for good scaffold branches. You want good symmetry. You don't want all your branches on one side, and you don't want them too close together. And you're looking for small diameter branches, thinner than what they're growing from, not more than half the size of what they're growing from, the trunk or another branch. So that's pretty much the general kinds of stuff. And now we're going to look at what your pruning targets are. What kind of a branch would you be looking at pruning? And what you're looking for basically is defects. You'll take out dead branches. You'll take you will either take out with removal cut or reduce a damaged branch. We've already talked about what to do about a branch that's maybe broken at the tip. Crossing branches, if they're not already touching each other and rubbing and creating openings where decay can get in, They will as they get larger. And the branch structure on a tree, the branches are going to be coming off the trunk. Some of them come kind of straight out. More likely they're more up in kind of a V shape. And if you've got one that's growing backwards in toward the center of the tree, or is growing straight up or straight down, these are anomalies. They often don't have a good connection to the branch they're growing from, and you're probably going to take them off. Clustered branches. I'll show you an example of that. It's easier to talk about it with the example. Included bark. Show you an example of that. Branches creating clearance issues. You have a branch that's growing into an area where you don't want it to be. You may do a reduction cut. And if you make a reduction cut back to another branch that's a third the size, you want to make sure that the direction that the branch that you're cutting back to is going in is away from whatever it is you were trying to keep the branch clear from. Codominance, we're going to talk a lot about that. Anywhere on the tree, you're typically going to deal with codominance with a pruning cut. Adventitious growth, water sprouts, suckers, and stubs. Stubs are the results of poor pruning, and we'll talk about why you would be dealing with stubs. And then you want to be looking down too. You want to look on the surface and see whether or not you have circling or girdling roots, because you'll need to deal with those. So let's look at some of these. Here's our totally screwed up tree. It has broken branches and dead branches and rubbing branches and crossing branches and water sprouts and suckers, and it's a mess. So here's a tree with some broken branches. 1, 2, 3. Now, sooner or later, those branches are going to dry out. They're going to fall. And it's always better for us to decide when they come out of the tree than for nature to decide, because they're liable to come down on a car or come down on you or whatever. So we take out broken branches, dead branches, and where we can, we try to deal with a broken branch with a reduction cut. And for some technical reasons, none of these could have a reduction cut because there's no branch coming off any of them before their source. It's a third of their size. So they're going to have to be cut right back to their source. And we'll talk about how you make those decisions and where you make the cut as we go along. And here's an example of clustered branches. You'll note that we've got a trunk here that's quite thick. And after this whole cluster of side branching, look at how narrow it is. So not a lot of water and nutrients are getting up here. They're all being diverted into these side branches. And all of this branching is occurring within just a couple of feet on the trunk. That is a potential weak point. You could have the trunk break there under stress, wind, ice, snow. So you'd probably want to take a few of these off. Here's a number of things. Here's branches that are too close together. This one and this one. As they get larger, they're going to bang into each other. They're going to start scraping bark off and creating an opening where decay-causing agents can get in. So you would need to choose which of those two you want to keep. One of them you would remove. Here we have a crossing branch situation. They may not be rubbing against each other right at the moment, but as they get bigger, they will. So you'd want to deal with that. And I'll give you a solution in a moment. If you follow this branch up, it gets up to here and it takes a right angle turn. You rarely see that on a tree, but the problem with it is that this kind of a joint is not going to be able to handle a lot of weight. Once this branch will never get to be 4 inches or 6 inches. It will break right here because it won't be able to handle the weight that's going out sideways. So a simple solution to both your crossing potential here and this right angle turn would be to take this branch off here. Then you no longer have a crossing issue and you don't have this right angle turn issue. Another option would be you could do a reduction cut, maybe right there. If this branch is a third of the size of that, which I'm not sure it is, this one is down here. So you might cut it there. If you look at this situation here and determine that, oh, it doesn't look like they're ever going to rub, you could do a reduction cut here and solve this right angle turn problem. And then we have what we call face slappers, which is you've got a bottom branch on the tree. Let's say this tree is at 8 feet off the ground. This one you can walk under these branches because they don't come down below 8 feet. But here they're starting at 8 feet and growing downward, and they might be down to, 3 or 4 feet off the ground. So you can't run your lawnmower under there without hitting a branch. Or they're getting in the way of whatever kind of activity you're performing under the tree, if it's in your yard and your kids are playing there. So you're probably going to take those branches off. But if you take them off, which is a reasonable activity, the same amount of water and nutrients are going to be coming up to this branch as were before. And what it's going to cause it to do is the main branch is going to grow longer. And you can see what's happening with these branches, which is pretty typical. They're all growing downward at the end because their weight is pulling them down. So if it starts growing much longer, it's going to keep coming lower and lower and lower. So you probably are going to need to, if you take these off, do a reduction cut out here somewhere and take some of the weight off this, take some of the length off it. So you can have secondary effects from a pruning cut, and you need to think about what those secondary effects might be and whether you need to do something about it. And one thing you could do is, you could take those off one season and see what's happening with the growth here, and wait until the next season before you make the reduction cut, or see whether you need to then. So if it's a tree that's on your own property, you have a lot of control about timing. You don't have to do everything all at once. If you're working with us, sometimes we'll get to an area where we're pruning for city or county government, and we know we're not going to be back there for a while. So sometimes we'll be a little more aggressive with our pruning than we normally would be because we're not going to see the tree for a few years. And here's another situation where you have to take some lower branches off. If you have a corner lot and you have a traffic sign, it has to be visible. But you may recall that I said earlier that you can do some of your pruning work at the time you select your tree for the place where you want to plant it. And a tree with this particular branching structure, with the branches coming more outward in a low V shape, maybe you should have picked a different tree like this one. This you may be familiar with. This is Zelkova, and it is the main street tree in most of the communities in the eastern United States because it's in the elm family, and elms have a high V shape. So you can see that these branches are not coming anywhere near the pedestrian traffic that would be using the sidewalk or vehicular traffic in the road. So local governments plant a lot of these because it means they don't have to send their crews out to prune them because they grow naturally out of the way, as opposed to that tree. That's not the best tree to be planting near a street or near your house. Basically, it's too big for that location. So again, it kind of undermines the idea of checking out your site before you plant your tree and making sure that the tree that you plant there is going to fit when it's mature. And here's adventitious growth. When it's either coming up from the roots or low on the trunk, it's typically referred to as suckers. When you see it out on branches or higher up on the trunk, it's typically referred to as water sprouts. It's all adventitious growth. It's not helping the tree, and generally you're going to take them off. What you have here are very poor, weak connections. So they're very likely to break as they get larger anyways. So save that happening and take them off. Included bark, I'm going to show you an example of that. Here we are. Okay. Here you have your main stem, your trunk, and you have a branch coming off it. And you can see the line. It starts right here, goes all the way down to here. Both of them have bark on their inside, and they're not connecting. So when this branch, which is now about an inch around, gets to be a foot around, with a lot of weight on the upper part of it, it's going to be pulling away from the tree, and it's a very likely failure point. So when you find included bark, you're typically going to do a pruning cut to remove it. So we made the cut right here. And you can see we cut through. Actually, I cut through that. I was holding the upper part of the branch and doing the cut, and I got almost all the way in and it broke. And that's actually good in this particular case because I didn't cut. I was trying not to cut through and damage the trunk. And fortunately, it broke away for me before I even had to get all the way in. So that was great. But that's what you do with included bark situations. So you need to keep an eye out for that. You'll see it. It's pretty obvious. And then we have stubs. Okay, so somebody made these pruning cuts and they made them too far out from the tree. This cut should have been made right here, this one right here, this one right here. How do I know that? Well, I know that for the reason that you're going to know that in about 15 minutes when we talk about where you make your cut. So I can just look at that very quickly and know immediately they cut too far out, and I know exactly where to make the cut. So you would recut these further in, and we'll talk later about where and why. But that's sloppy work. The issue with it isn't just that it doesn't look good. The issue is that the tree is not going to be able to protect itself against the entry of decay-causing agents when you leave a stub, and you'll soon learn why, if you don't already know. And then we have root problems, surface root problems. Here we have what we call a circling root. So this should have been dealt with the day the tree was planted, because this would have been obvious. You would have seen that you have a root that's going in a circular direction around the tree. It's never going to help the tree. So you would have cut it at the time that you put it into the ground, but they didn't. So what's going to happen with this tree and this root as they grow older and bigger is this. They're going to grow into each other as they get larger. And you can actually see the effect of what's happening here. Notice how the bark is falling off here? That's because this is constricting the vascular, the phloem and xylem to the point where it's not getting good flow. It's not getting good movement. So it's got to come out. This is pretty easy. You'd make a cut here, make a cut here, take it away, and you're done. Cutting a root is the same thing as cutting a branch. This is maybe a 3-inch root. It's the same thing as taking off a 3-inch branch. The tree will be able to manage that. This root is offering no help to the tree from the standpoint of stability. In order for a tree to be helping to hold the tree up, it's got to be going out, not around. This one's tougher. You'd make your cuts here, but it's a pretty big root. It's about 6 inches. And you have 3 choices. You can leave it the way it is, you can take it out yourself, or you can hire or actually ask an arborist to come out and take a look at it, because it's a pretty big cut. Anyhow, that's circling and girdling roots.